The old Victorian house on Maple Street had been sanctuary for 47 years. Its creaking hardwood floors, high ceilings, and faded wallpaper held memories of a full life, children's laughter, holiday gatherings, and the kind of warmth that only comes from a home truly lived in. Now, those same walls echoed with a silence so profound that sometimes forgot what her own voice sounded like. 7-year-old Emma lived in the smallest bedroom on the second floor, a room painted soft yellow that had prepared with such hope and love 3 years ago. But the cheerful color seemed to mock the child who occupied it, a little girl who had somehow learned to disappear while still being physically present. Emma was what the school psychologist called selectively mute, a diagnosis that sounded clinical and distant but meant something far more tragic in its heart. Her granddaughter could speak. Her voice box functioned perfectly fine. The doctors had confirmed this multiple times, but something deeper had broken inside Emma, something no amount of medical expertise could fix with pills or procedures. It was her spirit that had gone silent, and no one seemed to know how to resurrect it. The fracture had begun 4 years earlier, when Emma was only 3 years old. Thomas, only son, had married young and recklessly. He and Emma's mother, Sarah, had produced Emma in a flurry of passion and poor planning, two people who never should have been parents but were thrust into it anyway. For the first 3 years of Emma's life, watched her son stumble through fatherhood with the grace of a drunk elephant. Arguments became the background music of Emma's early childhood. Sarah would scream about Thomas's infidelities. Thomas would rage about Sarah's spending habits. And somewhere in between, little Emma learned that love meant pain, that homes weren't safe, and that the people supposed to protect you were too busy destroying each other to notice you existed. Then came the day that changed everything. Emma's mother simply left, not gradually, not with warning, but suddenly. She packed 3 suitcases on a Thursday afternoon while Emma was at preschool and left a note on the kitchen counter. "I can't do this anymore," it read. No mention of her daughter. No goodbye, no forwarding address, just gone like she had been erased from existence. Thomas spiraled. He drank too much, slept too late, and forgot to pack Emma's lunch for school. He forgot her recitals. He forgot her birthday. Eventually, he stopped pretending that he wanted custody at all. Within 6 months, he had moved to California with a new girlfriend and filed for custody to be transferred to, not out of any sense of responsibility, but out of convenience. Emma was a problem he could solve by handing her off to someone else, who had already raised 3 children and was looking forward to her golden years of gardening and book clubs, suddenly found herself raising her granddaughter. She didn't hesitate for a moment. Family was family, and Emma needed someone. But when Emma first arrived at the house on Maple Street, the little girl was already different. She spoke in whispers. She flinched at loud noises. She had nightmares that woke her screaming at 2 a.m. The trauma had already taken root. For the first 6 months, tried everything. She took Emma to child psychologists who prescribed medication that made her sleepy and vacant. She enrolled her in music classes, hoping to unlock some door inside her. She read every parenting book written in the last decade. Nothing worked. And then slowly, Emma stopped trying altogether. The whispers became silence. The flinches became a kind of numb acceptance of the world. By age 7, Emma had perfected the art of invisibility. At school, her teachers reported that Emma was a good listener and well-behaved, which were polite ways of saying she was a ghost. She completed her assignments perfectly but never raised her hand. During group presentations, she would stand silently while her assigned partner did all the talking. At lunch, she ate alone, not because no one would sit with her, but because she seemed to exist in a bubble that other children couldn't penetrate. The other kids had stopped trying to include her. Children sense brokenness instinctively, and they tend to avoid it. Watch this slow erasure with a mother's helplessness. She had managed to keep Emma alive, fed, clothed, and educated. She had done the basic job of guardianship, but she was failing at the most important part. She was losing her granddaughter to an internal darkness that no amount of love seemed able to penetrate. Emma would curl up next to her on the couch while watched television, but her small body remained rigid, never relaxing, never truly connecting. It was like holding a doll that happened to have a pulse. The anxiety manifested in physical ways too. Emma developed a nervous habit of picking at the skin around her fingernails until they bled. She developed headaches that no medication could touch. She complained of stomach pains before school each day and couldn't tell if they were psychosomatic or if her granddaughter was genuinely ill. Some mornings, getting Emma out of bed and dressed felt like trying to move a statue. The child would lie there, staring at the ceiling with empty eyes, and would have to coax her through each task. "Let's put on your socks, Emma. Now your shoes. Now we're going to go eat breakfast." Narrating life like it was a children's show, trying to inject some enthusiasm into every mundane action. Had read all the articles about childhood trauma. She understood that Emma's brain was essentially stuck in survival mode, that her nervous system had learned to expect danger around every corner. The experts said that time would heal, that with patience and stability, children could recover. But was 65 years old, and she didn't know if she had enough time left to undo what had been done to her granddaughter in those crucial first years of life. At night would lie awake in her own bed, listening to the creaks and groans of the old house, and she would weep quietly. She loved Emma with a fierceness that surprised her, but she was terrified that her love alone wouldn't be enough. She had already lived a full life, accomplished things, and built a comfortable retirement for herself. She hadn't signed up for this second act of parenting, especially not with a child so wounded that she seemed beyond repair. But was a woman of faith and stubborn determination, and deep down, she refused to accept that Emma was lost forever. Somewhere inside that silent, anxious little girl was a spark waiting to be reignited, just hadn't figured out how to find it yet. She didn't know that the answer would come from the most unlikely of sources, a broken dog with eyes just as haunted as her granddaughter's. That realization was still months away. For now, simply held on day by day, hoping that tomorrow would bring some kind of breakthrough. Decision came to her on a Tuesday morning, fully formed and undeniable as if it had been waiting in her subconscious all along. She was sitting at the kitchen table with her third cup of coffee, watching Emma pick at her oatmeal without actually eating any of it, when something inside simply snapped, not in anger but in desperate resolve. This child was slipping away. The school had called again yesterday, concerned about Emma's lack of social engagement. The pediatrician had suggested that perhaps they should increase her medication. Even Emma's therapist seemed to have run out of ideas, offering well-meaning platitudes about patience and time. But knew that what Emma needed wasn't more pills or more therapy sessions. What Emma needed was a reason to connect with the world again, a reason to speak, a reason to believe that there was something worth living for beyond the walls of her own anxiety. She had read once about animal therapy, about how traumatized individuals sometimes responded to animals in ways they never could to humans. Animals didn't judge. They didn't demand conversation. They simply existed in the present moment, and somehow that existence could be healing. Had dismissed the idea as too simplistic, but as she watched Emma's dead eyes stare into middle distance while her mouth mechanically chewed food she would likely spit out later, wondered if maybe simplicity was exactly what they needed. "We're going somewhere special today," announced, her voice firmer than it had been in weeks. Emma's eyes flickered toward her grandmother, a tiny moment of awareness breaking through the fog. "We're going to the animal shelter. I think it's time we saw what's there." The Riverside Animal Shelter sat on the edge of town, a sprawling complex of concrete buildings and outdoor enclosures that had been expanding for the past 5 years. The facility served a 6-county area, housing everything from abandoned cats to confiscated exotic animals. Had never been there before, but she had researched it thoroughly before making her announcement to Emma. She knew it was clean, well-run, and that the staff genuinely cared about the animals in their care. The morning was gray and drizzly, which somehow felt fitting. Emma sat in the passenger seat of old, still not speaking, staring out the window as the town's familiar landmarks gave way to rural roads lined with bare trees. When they pulled into the parking lot, Emma's shoulders tensed visibly. Could see her granddaughter's hands clenching into fists. "We're just going to look," said gently. "No pressure, we can leave whenever you want to leave, okay?" Emma gave the smallest nod. The shelter's front office was warm and smelled like coffee and cleaning supplies. A cheerful young woman at the front desk greeted them and explained that they were just interested in looking around. The staff member led them through a corridor lined with photographs of successfully adopted animals, smiling dogs with their new families, cats perched on laps, before and after shots that told stories of rescue and redemption. But as they moved deeper into the facility, the atmosphere changed. The sounds grew louder. Barking echoed through the corridors, some curious, some desperate, some filled with an aggression born from fear and pain. Felt Emma's small hand slip into hers, gripping tightly. Her granddaughter's breathing had quickened, her body rigid with anxiety. In that moment, almost turned back. Maybe this had been a terrible idea. Maybe she was traumatizing Emma further. But then something made her push forward. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was the faint glimmer of hope that sometimes change required stepping into discomfort first. The main kennels were arranged in 2 long rows. Dogs of all sizes and temperaments were housed behind metal gates and glass barriers. Some rushed toward the visitors, their tails wagging frantically, desperate for human contact. Others backed into corners, trembling. Most existed somewhere in between, aware of the visitors but cautious, having learned that interaction wasn't always safe. And Emma walked slowly down the first row. A golden retriever mix pressed against the glass, his tongue lolling out in an endless smile. A small terrier yapped incessantly. An older boxer lay on her bed, too tired to care about the passing humans. Emma clutched hand but said nothing, as usual. They were nearly to the end of the first row when heard it, a sound unlike the others. Not a playful bark or an aggressive snarl, but a howl of pure anguish. It was the kind of sound that reached into your chest and squeezed your heart. Felt Emma freeze completely. At the very end of the row, in a corner enclosure, was a dog that seemed to exist in his own isolated universe. He was large, a German Shepherd mix, guessed, though his build was so malnourished that it was hard to tell his true size. His fur was matted and discolored in places, as if it hadn't been properly groomed in months. One of his ears stood straight up, the other folded in on itself at an odd angle. But it was his face that captured attention, and marked by what looked like old injuries. His eyes held a wild mixture of fear and rage, the eyes of an animal that had forgotten how to trust. He was in the back of his enclosure, packing in a tight circle, occasionally throwing his head back in that heartbreaking howl. A sign on his gate read, "Max German Shepherd mix 4 years old, caution, unadoptable." Every other visitor who passed Max's enclosure hurried by quickly, some pulling their children away. The dog's aggression was palpable even through the barrier. But Emma had stopped walking entirely. Felt her granddaughter's hand go slack in hers. Emma was staring at Max with an intensity that hadn't seen in her in 3 years. "Come on, honey," gently urged, trying to move them forward. But Emma wouldn't budge. She stood there, completely still, just watching the broken dog pace his concrete cage. "He's just scared," a voice came from behind them. They turned to see a young man in a shelter uniform, probably in his mid-20s, with kind eyes. "That's Max. He came to us about 8 months ago. Found him on the side of the highway, hit by a car, deliberately abused before that, we think. He's been with us longer than any dog here. No one wants him. Most days he won't even eat." Emma's eyes never left Max. The dog, sensing their presence, suddenly stopped packing. He turned to face the glass, his injured ear twitching. For a moment, dog and girl simply stared at each other, 2 beings completely shattered by the world, recognizing something of themselves in each other's brokenness. Then Max did something unexpected. He walked to the front of his enclosure, his aggressive posture softening slightly. His face pressed near the glass, just a few feet from where Emma stood. He didn't growl. He didn't display the teeth that everyone warned about. Instead, A small, trembling whine escaped his throat, a sound of loneliness so profound that felt tears spring to her eyes. Emma raised her small hand and pressed it against the glass, mirroring Max's position perfectly. The two of them stayed like that for what felt like an eternity, broken child and broken dog, communicating in a language that had nothing to do with words. When finally gently pulled Emma away to leave the shelter, her granddaughter turned back one last time, her eyes locked on Max's, and for the first time in 3 years, saw something flicker across her granddaughter's face that looked dangerously like hope. The following Saturday, Emma was ready before finished her breakfast. She stood by the front door in her coat, her small face arranged in an expression of barely contained anticipation. It was the most animated had seen her granddaughter in years. Without being asked, Emma had packed a backpack with a blanket, a water bottle, and a notebook where she had drawn crude pictures of a dog with one ear standing up and one folded down. Max. She had drawn Max. "We're going to visit him," Emma had whispered the question, her voice so soft that almost missed it. It was only 3 words, barely audible, but they felt like a revolution. "Yes, sweetheart," had replied, trying to keep her own voice steady despite the tears threatening to spill over. "We're going to visit him." Every Saturday after that became sacred. Rain or shine, cold or hot, they made the drive to Riverside Animal Shelter, would sit in the lobby with her knitting or a book, and Emma would be led back to Max's enclosure by one of the staff members who had quickly become invested in the unusual friendship forming before their eyes. The first few weeks were about trust. Max had decades of hurt built into his nervous system, and Emma had her own walls constructed brick by brick from abandonment and fear. They had to meet each other carefully, like 2 animals emerging from hibernation into a world they weren't sure was safe. Emma would sit on the cold concrete floor in front of Max's cage, and she would simply be there. She didn't reach through the bars. She didn't make demands. She just existed in his presence, sometimes for hours at a time. She would hum, wordless, tuneless humming that seemed to calm both herself and the damaged dog. Max would pace for a while, then gradually settle, until eventually he would lie down on his bed, his eyes tracking Emma's every movement. The shelter staff began to recognize their pattern. "She's here to see Max again," they would ask in the lobby, always with the same expression of tender bewilderment. Most people who came to the shelter were looking for a pet. Emma and Max weren't looking for each other, they were recognizing each other. By the 3rd week, Max stopped growling when Emma approached. The transformation was subtle but revolutionary. The constant tension that had lived in his shoulders began to ease. His breathing became less frantic. One Saturday, when Emma sat down in her usual spot, Max walked to the front of his cage and lay down with his nose just inches from where her small hand rested. Emma didn't cry. She didn't speak. She simply placed her palm flat on the cool concrete and let Max rest his nose against it, separated only by the bars that imprisoned him in this shelter existence. That single moment of physical connection seemed to unlock something in both of them. By week 6, Emma had started to bring things. She brought a tennis ball that she would roll across the floor toward Max's cage. He would retrieve it and push it back, and they would repeat this exchange over and over, a silent conversation conducted through the barrier between them. She brought crackers from home, feeding them to him through the bars one by one, her fingers never trembling despite how dangerous this was supposed to be. She brought her school drawings and would hold them up against the glass, narrating what she had drawn in whispers so quiet that could barely hear her from the lobby. "This is a tree," Emma would explain, pointing to her crude green scribble. "You could sleep under a tree. It would be cool and nice. We could both sleep under it together." The staff members who worked at the shelter started asking permission to let Emma volunteer officially. They had never seen anything like it. The dog that had been deemed unadoptable was transforming. He wasn't aggressive anymore. He wasn't withdrawn. He was present and responsive, animated by a purpose that seemed to be purely Emma. "It's like she's showing him that he's worth something, one of the younger staff members, a girl named Sarah, said to one Saturday. "I've never seen Max like this. She's changing him." Watched her granddaughter during these visits and understood that the change was absolutely mutual. Emma was changing too. She had started to eat more, her small frame filling out slightly. The dark circles under her eyes weren't quite so pronounced. More importantly, she was beginning to inhabit her own skin again, to exist in the present moment rather than trapped in the anxiety of her past or the fear of her future. It was during week 12 that everything shifted irreversibly. Emma had been sitting with Max for about an hour that Saturday. Was in the lobby when she heard her granddaughter's voice echoing down the corridor, not the whispered fragments she had been producing, but an actual, full sentence, spoken with surprising clarity. "I love you, Max." Knitting needles slipped from her hands. She stood up slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. By the time she reached the enclosure, she found Emma with her arms wrapped around Max through the bars of his cage, her face buried in his matted fur. The dog's entire body was vibrating, and realized he was trembling, not from fear or aggression, but from the overwhelming intensity of being truly loved. Sarah, the young staff member, had followed back to the enclosure. She was openly crying. "Did you hear that?" whispered, hardly daring to believe it. "I heard it," Sarah confirmed. She actually spoke." That evening, sat Emma down at the kitchen table after dinner, her hands shaking slightly as she asked the question she had been terrified to ask. "Honey, what if we adopted Max? What if he came to live with us at home?" Emma's eyes went wide. For a moment, thought perhaps she had overstepped, suggested something too impossible. But then Emma's mouth opened, and out came a flood of words, still quiet, still careful, but words nonetheless. "Really, we could take Max home. He wouldn't have to stay in the cage anymore. He could sleep in my room. We could be a family." Felt something crack open inside her own chest. In that moment, she understood what had happened. Emma hadn't healed Max. They had healed each other. Two broken beings had recognized the fractures in each other and had slowly, carefully begun to piece each other back together. "Yes, sweetheart," said, reaching across the table to hold her granddaughter's hand. "We could be a family." The adoption paperwork took 2 weeks to process. Max had to be evaluated by the veterinarian to ensure he was healthy enough for a home environment. There were questions about whether a child and such a traumatized dog should be together. But Emma and had become persuasive advocates for their unlikely trio. They shared their story, the story of two broken souls finding each other in the darkness and discovering that healing was possible. When they finally brought Max home on a Saturday morning in early April, Emma led him carefully into the house by his leash. The dog walked with uncertainty, as if he couldn't quite believe that this was real, that this wasn't some temporary respite before returning to the cage. But then Emma guided him to the living room and sat down on the floor, and Max curled up beside her, his head resting on her lap. And there, in the afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows of the old Victorian house on Maple Street, watched her granddaughter and the broken dog discover what it meant to be home. The summer following Max's arrival was the most peaceful had experienced in 3 years. Emma blossomed in ways that seemed almost miraculous. She enrolled in a day camp and actually participated in activities rather than sitting silently on the sidelines. She made friends, real friends, girls her age who would call the house asking if Emma could play. For the first time since Sarah had abandoned her, Emma was laughing. Genuinely, freely laughing. Max transformed alongside her. The aggressive scars on his face seemed less prominent somehow, as if the emotional healing was literally rewriting his physical appearance. He had put on weight, his ribs no longer visible beneath his fur. He had learned to play fetch, to sit and stay, to sleep peacefully through the night without nightmares manifesting in violent thrashing. He and Emma had developed an almost telepathic bond. The dog seemed to know when Emma was anxious before she did, pressing against her legs to ground her, offering comfort without being asked. had even started dadding again, something she thought had left her life forever. A kind man named Robert who came to book club had asked her to dinner. She had hesitated, wondering if she should prioritize Emma exclusively, but Emma had surprised her. "You should go, Grandma," Emma had said, scratching behind Max's ears as he rested his head on her lap. "You deserve to be happy too." There were moments when would watch Emma and Max together and feel an almost overwhelming sense of gratitude. She had made the right choice that rainy day at the shelter. She had trusted her instinct, and it had paid dividends beyond her wildest expectations. Emma was healing. They were becoming a real family. That was why the knock on the door on a Tuesday afternoon in late June felt like lightning striking a clear sky. Was in the kitchen preparing dinner when she heard it. Emma was upstairs doing her summer reading and Max was napping on the living room rug. Opened the door to find a man standing on her porch, tall, with Emma's same brown eyes, dressed in an expensive suit despite the heat. For a moment didn't recognize him. Then it clicked. Thomas, Emma's father. She hadn't seen him in over 3 years. "Hello, Mother," he said, his voice carrying the false warmth of someone who had learned to navigate social situations through charm rather than genuine connection. "May I come in?" His first instinct was to slam the door in his face. Instead, she stepped aside, her mind already running through possibilities. Why was he here? He had signed away his parental rights. He had made no effort to contact Emma since handing her off to care. Thomas walked into the living room like he owned it, stepping over Max's sleeping form without so much as acknowledging the dog. He settled himself on the couch, crossing his legs in a way that suggested he had rehearsed this moment. "I've been doing well," he began, not waiting for to ask. "Very well, actually. I got promoted to senior vice president at my company. My wife, you haven't met Jennifer, have you? Jennifer and I have been talking about starting a family, or rather about expanding our family." Felt her stomach drop. She remained standing, her hands clenched at her sides. "I want Emma back," Thomas said simply. "I want to give her opportunities, a real home, a father. California has some of the best schools in the country. Jennifer's family has connections everywhere. Emma could have everything." "Emma has everything she needs," said, her voice surprisingly steady given that her world was tilting on its axis. "She's thriving here. She's happy." "She's 7 years old," Thomas replied, and there was something cold in his voice now, the charm dissipating. "She doesn't get to decide what's best for her. I'm her father. I have rights. I have resources. And frankly, Mother, you're retired and on a fixed income. Jennifer and I can provide things you simply cannot." He pulled a manila envelope from his briefcase and placed it on the coffee table. "My lawyer drew this up. I'm filing for custody. I'm giving you the courtesy of telling you first, but make no mistake, I will win this. The courts favor the biological parent, especially one who can provide significant advantages." Stared at the envelope as if it were a snake coiled to strike. "Thomas, you abandoned her. You chose a new life over your daughter." "I was young and stupid," he said, and he sounded almost convincing. "I've grown up. I've built a life. Now I want to include Emma in it. Surely you can understand that a child belongs with her father when he's capable and willing." Before could respond, Emma appeared at the top of the stairs. She had heard voices and come down to investigate. When she saw her father, she froze completely. Her hand reached down automatically, and Max, sensing her distress, rose from his nap and pressed against her legs. Thomas smiled, that same charming smile that had probably seduced Jennifer and countless others before her. "Emma, there you are. You've grown so much. Come give your dad a hug." Emma didn't move. Her eyes had gone wide with that familiar look of panic that thought had finally faded. Max's entire body had tensed, his protective instincts activating at the spike of anxiety radiating from the child he loved. "Not now," said firmly. "Emma needs time to process, and you need to leave." Thomas stood up, his expression hardening. "I'll be in touch through my lawyer. Don't try to prevent me from seeing my daughter. It won't look good in court." After he left, Emma came downstairs with Max glued to her side. Her small face was pale, her breathing shallow. "Is he going to take me away?" Emma whispered. Pulled her granddaughter into her arms, feeling Emma's entire body trembling. Max climbed into their laps, creating a protective cocoon around the child. Wanted to lie, to tell Emma that everything would be fine. But Emma deserved the truth, or at least some version of it. "He's going to try," said quietly. "He filed something with lawyers, but I'm going to fight him, Emma. I'm going to fight him with everything I have." That night Emma couldn't sleep. Found her at 2 a.m. sitting on the kitchen floor with Max, both of them staring at nothing. Emma had regressed, the selective mutism returning in full force, her voice locked away again by the trauma of seeing her father and the terror of losing her home. Called her own lawyer first thing in the morning. The news was not good. "He has a strong case," her lawyer said grimly. "He's employed, married, financially stable. He's offering genuine improvements in her material circumstances. And you're an older woman. The courts sometimes worry about that, especially if there are younger alternatives available." But Emma doesn't want to go with him. She's thriving here. She has a dog she loves. She has a community. "None of that matters as much as you'd think," said. "The court will ultimately decide what's in the child's best interest, and judges often equate that with financial security and paternal involvement. We have a fight on our hands." Hung up the phone and looked at Emma, who sat at the kitchen table with Max's head on her lap, both of them wearing the same expression of terrified resignation. The peaceful summer they had built together suddenly felt as fragile as spun glass, ready to shatter at the slightest disturbance. The custody battle had begun, and was about to learn just how much she was willing to sacrifice to keep her granddaughter safe. The week leading up to the custody hearing was the longest of her life. She had experienced many difficult chapters, raising 3 children on a single teacher's salary after her husband died, navigating her own health crises, managing the trauma of Emma's arrival. But nothing had prepared her for the particular agony of watching your greatest love slip through your fingers while you stood powerless to stop it. Emma had essentially stopped functioning 3 days before the hearing. The selective mutism had returned with a vengeance, but it was worse than before because Emma had tasted what it felt like to speak, to connect, to exist in the world. Now being unable to do so seemed to compound her anguish exponentially. She had stopped eating. She would sit at the kitchen table and push food around her plate without ever bringing it to her mouth. Had tried tempting her with her favorite foods, the fresh-baked cookies Emma loved, the pasta with butter and parmesan she had been eating with enthusiasm just days before. Nothing worked. At night, Emma didn't sleep. Would lie in her own bed and listen to her granddaughter's footsteps packing in the room above, hour after hour. Once or twice, heard the small, strangled sounds of Emma crying, trying to muffle her sobs into her pillow so as not to wake her grandmother, but never slept anyway. She lay there, staring at the ceiling, her mind cycling through nightmare scenarios. Emma in California with a father she barely knew, Max taken to an animal shelter because Emma wasn't there to care for him. The emptiness that would fill this old house once both of them were gone. Her lawyer had called that morning with a final update. The hearing was scheduled for 10 a.m. sharp. Thomas's lawyer had submitted a preliminary brief arguing that while had done adequate work as a temporary guardian, Thomas's superior financial resources and presence of a stable 2-parent household made him the more suitable custodian. They had submitted letters from Emma's school about her previous behavioral issues and anxiety. They had provided documentation of Thomas's salary, his home in San, the excellent schools in his district. "We're going to argue stability," had said. "We're going to emphasize Emma's regression in response to his appearance. We're going to ask the judge to consider her wishes. But I need to be honest with you, it's an uphill battle." By the evening before the hearing, Emma had essentially shut down completely. She was awake but not present, Her eyes glazed over with a kind of dissociative numbness that recognized from the earliest days after Emma had arrived at the house. She sat on the kitchen floor with Max, not speaking, not moving, just existing in a state of paralyzed anxiety. Had tried everything to comfort her. She had made her favorite meals. She had run warm baths with lavender oil. She had read to her from the picture books Emma had loved as a younger child. Nothing penetrated the fog of terror that had wrapped itself around her granddaughter. At 11 p.m., with Emma finally asleep on the couch next to Max, made a decision born of pure desperation. She picked up the phone and called Dr. Emma's therapist at her emergency number. "This is highly irregular," the doctor had said when explained the situation. They had been working together for 3 years. Knew Emma, understood her trauma, recognized the particular way her anxiety manifested. "But I think you might be onto something. Emotional support animals have been used in courtrooms before. It's not standard practice, but it has precedent." "Is there any chance it could work?" asked, her voice breaking. Could Max help her find her voice? There was a long pause. "Honestly, I don't know. But I know that without something, Emma might not be able to speak at all tomorrow. And if she can't advocate for herself, if she can't tell the judge how she feels about staying with you, then Thomas's case becomes almost unassailable. We have to try something." "What do I do?" "Call the courthouse first thing in the morning. Speak to the judge's clerk. Explain the situation. Ask for permission to have an emotional support animal present during Emma's testimony. They may say no, but they may surprise you. Then call the shelter where Max came from and get official documentation that he's been evaluated and is suitable for this kind of work. We need to make this look as legitimate as possible." After hanging up, sat in the darkness of her living room, watching her granddaughter and the dog she loved sleep fitfully on the couch. Max was pressed against Emma's back, his body curved protectively around her small form. Even in sleep, he seemed to sense that his girl needed him. Didn't sleep that night. Instead, she sat vigil, sometimes crying quietly, sometimes the kitchen, sometimes simply holding Emma's hand while she slept. She thought about her son, about the choices he had made, about how his selfishness had created this cascade of consequences. She thought about Sarah, Emma's mother, about the abandonment that had set everything in motion. She thought about the unfairness of a system that measured worth in dollar signs and property values rather than in love and devotion. At 6 a.m., when the sun was just beginning to break through the darkness, made her first phone call. The clerk at the courthouse was initially dismissive. "We don't typically allow animals in the courtroom." "This isn't a typical situation," said, trying to keep the desperation out of her voice but failing. "This is a child with severe anxiety and selective mutism. The animal is her emotional anchor. Without him, she won't be able to testify. And if she can't speak, how can the judge possibly determine what's in her best interest?" There was a long pause. Could practically hear the wheels turning in the clerk's mind as she weighed protocol against the reality of a terrified child, unable to advocate for herself. "Let me speak to the judge," the clerk finally said. "Call back in an hour." The next call was to Riverside Animal Shelter. Sarah, the young staff member who had fallen in love with Max's transformation, answered immediately. "I need documentation that Max is suitable for emotional support work," explained rapidly. "I need it today. I need it to hold up in a courtroom." Sarah didn't ask questions. She simply said, "I'll make it happen. We have a veterinarian on staff and a behavioral specialist. I'll get them to do an evaluation this morning and have the paperwork ready by noon." When called the courthouse back an hour later, she was transferred directly to the judge's chambers. Judge Harrison's voice was measured and thoughtful. "This is highly unusual," he said, echoing Dr. Swords. "But I've reviewed the case file. The child is clearly in distress. Emotional support animals have been allowed in courtrooms during testimony in cases involving trauma. If the animal is properly evaluated and certified, and if the animal remains calm in the courtroom environment, I'm willing to allow it. But this dog cannot disrupt the proceedings in any way. Is that understood?" "Yes, Your Honor. Thank you, Your Honor," said, and she actually wept with relief. That morning, Emma woke to her grandmother preparing her for court in a new way. Instead of just picking out her best dress and brushing her hair, sat Emma down and explained, as gently as she could, what was about to happen. "Max is going to be with you in the courtroom," said. "When you're scared, you can touch him, and I think that will help you find your voice." For the first time in 3 days, Emma's eyes focused on something other than the middle distance. She looked at her grandmother, then down at Max, who was watching them both intently. "Will he help me?" Emma whispered, her voice barely audible but present. "Yes, baby," said, pulling her granddaughter close. "He'll help you. He's always been able to help you." Courthouse was a brutalist structure of gray stone and imposing architecture, the kind of building designed to make ordinary people feel small and powerless. Emma pressed against the side as they climbed the front steps, her tiny hand gripping her grandmother's with such force that could feel her fingernails digging into her skin. Max walked between them, his leash held firmly by Sarah from the shelter, who had come to support them and provide official documentation of Max's emotional support certification. The courtroom itself was exactly as intimidating as had feared. High ceilings, dark wood paneling, a massive bench where Judge Harrison sat, his gray hair and stern expression suggesting a man who had seen every manipulation, every lie, every desperate plea that human nature could produce. There were spectators in the gallery, a few journalists who had caught wind of the unusual case about a child, a dog, and a custody battle. In the front row sat Thomas with his lawyer, an expensive suit named Richard who looked like he had won every custody case he had ever tried. Next to Thomas sat Jennifer, his new wife, dressed impeccably and smiling with the confidence of someone who had never faced real hardship. And Emma took their seats at the other table with their lawyer, leaned over and whispered, "Remember, we're going to let them present their case first. Then it will be Emma's turn to testify. Just breathe. We have a plan." But Emma wasn't breathing. She was sitting completely rigid, her eyes locked on some point in the middle distance, her body essentially frozen. Could feel the anxiety radiating off her granddaughter like heat from a furnace. Judge Harrison banged his gavel, and the proceedings began. Richard presented Thomas's case with practiced precision. He described Thomas's promotion, his stable employment, his marriage to Jennifer. He discussed the excellent schools in San, the opportunities available to Emma in California. He submitted documents showing Thomas's income, his home ownership, his financial stability. He made it sound so reasonable, so logical. Of course, a child would be better off with access to better schools, more money, a father who wanted to be involved. Then he submitted letters from Emma's previous teachers describing her behavioral issues, her anxiety, her selective mutism. He painted a picture of a troubled child who had made some progress with her grandmother, but who might benefit from professional therapeutic intervention available in a metropolitan area like San. He suggested, with barely concealed skepticism, that the bond with an animal, while perhaps emotionally comforting, was not a substitute for proper family structure and professional care. Objected repeatedly, but the judge overruled most of her objections. Then it was Emma's turn. She was called to the witness stand and watched her granddaughter walk toward it like someone walking toward execution. The court clerk asked her to raise her hand and swear to tell the truth. Emma's hand went up, trembling visibly. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth?" "I do," Emma whispered. Richard approached her with the kind of measured warmth that predatory professionals use when they've learned to weaponize charm. "Hello, Emma, I'm your dad's lawyer. Is that okay?" Emma didn't respond. She was staring at her lap. "Emma, can you answer the question? Is it okay that I'm here to talk to you?" "Yes," Emma said, but the word came out so quietly that the court reporter had to ask her to repeat it. "Emma, do you remember your father? Do you remember visiting him when you were younger?" Emma's jaw clenched. Could see the panic rising in her granddaughter's body, the way her shoulders had drawn up toward her ears, the way her hands had curled into fists. "Emma, can you answer that question for me?" There was a long silence. Emma's mouth opened and closed several times, but no sound emerged. "Your Honor," Richard said smoothly, "the witness appears to be having difficulty responding. Perhaps we could approach this differently." Judge Harrison nodded, making notes. Richard continued with his questions, his voice remaining patient and kind, but each question felt like a carefully laid trap. "Emma, wouldn't you like to live somewhere sunny? California has beautiful beaches, you know. Your father told me you like to swim. Is that true?" Emma's eyes filled with tears, but she still couldn't speak. "Emma, your grandmother is a very old woman, isn't she? She's retired. She probably can't do all the things a younger person could do. Your father and his wife Jennifer could take you on trips. They could give you experiences. Don't you think that would be nice?" Each question was designed to be perfectly reasonable, each one slightly poisoning the well. And Emma couldn't defend herself because she literally couldn't speak. Her throat had closed completely. Watched her granddaughter's face turn red with the effort of trying to produce words that simply would not come. "Your Honor," stood up, "I object. Counsel is badgering the witness and asking leading questions that are emotionally manipulative." "Sustained," Judge Harrison said, but he was looking at Emma with an expression that suggested he was already drawing conclusions. A child who couldn't advocate for herself might well need the protection and resources a father could provide, his expression seemed to say. Richard pressed on. "Emma, do you understand what would happen if you went to live with your father in California? You'd have a new school, new friends, a new home. Don't you think that might be an adventure?" Emma made a strangled sound, something between a sob and a scream, but still no words came out. Felt her own heart breaking as she watched her granddaughter dissolve into silent panic right there in front of the judge, the lawyers, the journalists, and the gallery full of observers. "I think the witness needs a moment," Judge Harrison said with something like compassion in his voice. "Let's take a 15-minute recess." During the recess, Emma couldn't even look at her grandmother. She sat in the bathroom of the courthouse with her head buried in its lap, her entire body racked with silent sobs. Paced outside the stall, making frustrated phone calls. "How did it go?" asked desperately when returned. "Not well," admitted. Without Emma able to speak, we have no way to counter their narrative. The judge seemed sympathetic to Thomas's argument that she's too unstable, too anxious, too dependent on her grandmother. He's going to be swayed by the resources argument. They returned to the courtroom for the continuation of Emma's testimony, but nothing had changed. She still couldn't speak. She still couldn't answer the questions. She just sat there, a small broken girl in a witness chair that was far too big for her, unable to save herself. By the time they broke for lunch, felt like they had already lost. Thomas and Jennifer sat at the other table, confident and relaxed. Jennifer was actually smiling, already imagining Emma in her California life, already mentally decorating a new bedroom. Met with in a small conference room outside the courtroom. "I'm going to make a request when we resume," said. "It's unconventional, possibly futile, but we have nothing to lose at this point. I'm going to ask the judge to allow the dog in the courtroom during her testimony. It's our only chance." Grabbed her lawyer's hand. "Do you think it will work?" "I think without it we've already lost," said quietly. "With it we have a chance, a slim one but a chance." They went back into the courtroom as the afternoon session began. Judge Harrison was settling back into his seat when stood up. "Your Honor, I'd like to make an unusual request. The witness is clearly experiencing significant anxiety that is preventing her from communicating. I've consulted with her therapist, and we believe that the presence of her emotional support animal might allow her to find her voice and provide testimony. The animal has been certified as suitable for this purpose." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Richard was already on his feet with an objection. But Judge Harrison raised his hand for silence. "Bring the dog in," he said simply. And suddenly, everything was about to change. The courtroom doors opened, and Sarah from the shelter led Max inside on his leash. The dog moved slowly, his face scanning the room with careful awareness. The courtroom fell silent. Every eye turned toward the large German Shepherd mix, the unlikely savior who was about to change the course of a child's entire life. Emma's entire body came alive. It was as if someone had plugged her back into an electrical socket. Her head snapped up. Her eyes, which had been vacant and terrified just moments before, suddenly focused with laser intensity on the dog walking toward her. She sat up in the witness chair, her small hands gripping the armrests. "Max," she whispered, so quietly that only those closest could hear. Sarah guided Max toward the witness stand and positioned him beside Emma's chair. The moment the dog was close enough, Emma reached down and wrapped her small arms around his neck, burying her face in his fur. For a long moment, nothing else existed in the world except girl and dog, reconnected across the sterile space of the courtroom. Judge Harrison watched this interaction with an expression that had shifted from skepticism to something approaching wonder. Even Richard's confident facade had cracked slightly. He exchanged a glance with his client, Thomas, who was frowning as if he didn't quite understand what he was witnessing. Emma stroked Max's head, her fingers finding the scars that marked his journey from abuse to salvation. She inhaled deeply, as if breathing in the familiarity of her best friend, her anchor, her reason for living. Then she looked up at the judge, and her voice emerged, not whispered, not halting, but clear and trembling with the weight of truth. "This is Max," Emma began, her voice growing stronger with each word. "He was hurt. People hurt him. He was scared. He didn't have anyone. He was in a cage all by himself, and nobody wanted him because he was broken." She paused, her hand never leaving Max's head. The dog seemed to sense the importance of this moment. He stood perfectly still, his body pressed against her leg, his presence a steady anchor. "I was broken too," Emma continued, and now her voice was ringing through the courtroom, every word carrying the weight of a child's hard-won truth. "My mommy left. My daddy left. I didn't talk anymore because talking didn't help. Nothing helped. I was alone in my own cage, even though there were no bars." Richard started to object, but Judge Harrison raised his hand silently. Even he seemed to understand that they were witnessing something beyond the normal rules of courtroom procedure. "Grandma found me," Emma said, her eyes locked on her grandmother's face. "She took me to find Max, and when I saw him, I saw myself. I saw someone who understood what it felt like to be broken and alone, and I started to visit him every Saturday. I didn't have to say anything, I just had to be there." Emma looked back down at Max, stroking his face with infinite tenderness. "And slowly Max got better, and I got better, because we healed each other. He showed me that even when you're broken, even when people hurt you, you can still be loved, and I showed him the same thing." Her voice was growing stronger now, more confident, as if every word she spoke was a brick in a wall she was building around her own heart. "Grandma didn't just save Max, she saved me. She was there when my mommy left. She was there when my daddy wasn't there. She was there every single day, even when I couldn't talk, even when I was too broken to be easy. She loved me anyway. She loved me when nobody else wanted me. She loved me enough to take me to the shelter every single Saturday for 6 months just so I could sit with a broken dog because she knew that was what I needed." Emma's eyes were streaming with tears now, but her voice remained steady and powerful. "If you take me away from Grandma, Max will die. Not right away maybe, but he will. Because I'm the only reason he wants to live. And I will die too on the inside because she's the only reason I'm alive. California is nice. I'm sure it's nice. but it doesn't have Grandma, it doesn't have Max, and those are the only things that matter to me. Those are the only things that make me want to keep living." She looked directly at her father and could see Thomas shift uncomfortably in his seat. "I don't know you, Dad," Emma said, and the simplicity of the statement was devastating. "You weren't there when I needed a dad. Grandma was there. Grandma is my family. Max is my family. That's home." Emma turned back to the judge, and she held his gaze with a steadiness that seemed impossible for a 7-year-old child. "I want to stay here with Grandma and with Max, please." The courtroom was completely silent. The journalists had stopped typing on their laptops. Richard was staring at his notes, his expression unreadable. Thomas looked like he had been physically struck. Even Jennifer's confident smile had faded. Judge Harrison removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. When he looked back up at Emma, his expression was one of profound sadness mixed with respect. "Thank you for your honesty, Emma," he said quietly. "That took a lot of courage." What happened next was something would replay in her mind for the rest of her life. Emma continued to speak, and it was as if a dam had broken inside her. All the words she had been holding inside for 3 years came pouring out. She talked about her nightmares. She talked about her anxiety. She talked about how had never raised her voice, had never been impatient, had loved her unconditionally even when Emma was barely functional. She talked about how Max had taught her that it was possible to trust again, that it was possible to heal, that brokenness didn't mean worthlessness. "Grandma and Max saved me," Emma said simply. "And I saved them too. That's what family is. Family is people who save each other, not because they have to, because they want to, because they love you no matter what." Was crying openly at the lawyer's table. Had to grip the edge of the bench to keep herself from running up to the witness stand and pulling her granddaughter into her arms right there in front of the judge. Even some of the spectators were crying. The journalists were frantically recording every word, understanding that they were witnessing a moment that transcended the normal custody case narrative. When Emma finally fell silent, exhausted but emptied of her fear, the courtroom remained quiet for a long moment. Judge Harrison looked at Richard, who seemed to have nothing left to say. He looked at Thomas, who was staring at his daughter as if seeing her for the first time, and there was something like shame written across his face. "I think we've heard everything we need to hear," Judge Harrison said quietly. And in that moment, something fundamental had shifted. Emma had done what trauma, therapy, and legal arguments could not do. She had spoken her truth with the unassailable honesty that only a child's voice can carry. She had not to a court, but to the power of love and family and the transformative nature of being truly seen and cherished. Max pressed his head against Emma's leg, and she rested her hand on his head, the two of them together once more. And everyone in that courtroom knew that Emma had already won. Judge Harrison took a full hour to render his decision. He requested that Emma and Max wait in a conference room while he completed his ruling, tried to manage expectations, but even she seemed hopeful. Richard had packed up his briefcase quickly, barely making eye contact with anyone. Thomas sat alone in the hallway, looking like a man who had suddenly understood exactly what he had lost by not showing up when it mattered. When they returned to the courtroom, Judge Harrison was already seated at the bench. He motioned for everyone to be in place, and then he began to read from a 20-page written decision that would later be published in legal journals as a landmark case in emotional support, animal testimony, and child advocacy. "This court has considered all the evidence presented in this matter," Judge Harrison began, his voice measured and formal. "The petitioner, Thomas Marshall, has presented a compelling financial case. He has documented resources, educational opportunities, and material advantages that would certainly provide his daughter with considerable comfort and security. The court does not dismiss these offerings lightly." Felt her heart sink. It sounded like the judge was about to rule against them. But then Judge Harrison continued. However, the court must ultimately determine what is in the best interest of the child, and that determination cannot be made in dollars and square footage. It must be made in love, stability, and the demonstrated commitment to a child's emotional well-being. He looked directly at Emma, who sat between and Max in the courtroom. 7-year-old Emma Marshall today with a clarity and honesty that I have rarely encountered in my 30 years on the bench, regardless of the age of the witness. She articulated, with profound wisdom, the nature of true family. Family is not created by biological accident or financial advantage. Family is created by showing up, day after day, for another human being, especially when that human being seems impossible to reach. Judge Harrison's eyes moved too. Marshall has demonstrated this commitment for 3 years. She took in a traumatized child who couldn't speak, who couldn't connect, who was essentially lost to the world. She didn't medicate away the symptoms. She didn't outsource the responsibility. She sat with that child in her brokenness and loved her unconditionally until the child found her way back to wholeness. He paused, looking at Max. The presence of this animal in these proceedings was initially highly irregular, but it became clear that this dog serves as a bridge between Emma and the world, between Emma and her ability to communicate and connect. In many ways, this dog is as much a member of the family as any human could be, and that family unit, grandmother, granddaughter, and dog, has demonstrated a commitment to each other that transcends the normal definitions of security and advantage. Judge Harrison's voice grew firmer. The court finds that while Thomas Marshall's financial resources are substantial, they do not outweigh the overwhelming evidence that Emma thrives under her grandmother's care. The child has regressed significantly since her father's appearance in her life, indicating that separation from her grandmother would be traumatic rather than beneficial. Furthermore, the child has explicitly, eloquently, and repeatedly stated her desire to remain with her grandmother. He banged his gavel. Custody of Emma Marshall shall remain with Marshall. The petitioner's request for custody modification is. However, this court recommends that the parties work toward establishing a relationship between Thomas Marshall and his daughter that is in the child's best interest and occurs at the child's pace, with the child's consent. The courtroom erupted. Some people applauded, quickly silenced by the bailiff, but not before Judge Harrison allowed himself a small smile, pulled Emma into her arms, and the child immediately began to cry huge, heaving sobs of relief and joy. Max barked once, a sound of pure celebration, and even the judge didn't correct him. Thomas left the courtroom without speaking to anyone. Jennifer followed, her perfect appearance slightly disheveled by the shock of defeat. Richard gathered his materials with the grim expression of a man who had encountered something his money and credentials couldn't overcome, the unassailable power of a child's love. The following year transformed Emma's life in ways that seemed almost miraculous. The selective mutism that had plagued her for 3 years completely resolved. She was not cured overnight, but with each passing month, her voice grew stronger, more confident, more present. She joined the school debate team and discovered that she loved public speaking. The very thing she had been unable to do seemed to fascinate her now that she had found her voice once. She made friends with ease. She joined the Girl Scouts and became known for her empathy and her ability to connect with other children who seemed isolated or struggling. Where she had once been invisible, she became someone people gravitated toward. Max continued to heal as well. The aggression that had marked his time at the shelter disappeared entirely. He became known in the neighborhood as the gentle dog who seemed to sense when someone was struggling. Children would ask to pet him, and Emma would tell them his story, the same story he had helped her tell in the courtroom. But the most significant change came when Emma was 8 years old. She approached her grandmother with an idea that found both beautiful and unsurprising. "Can we start a therapy dog program?" Emma asked. "For kids like me, kids who are broken and can't talk." With help, Emma began training to become a peer counselor for traumatized children. She worked with Doctor to develop a program that paired rescued dogs with children who were struggling. She called it Voices, because it was about finding the voice within that trauma had silenced. By age 10, Emma had helped 17 children find their voices through the Voices program. She became a local celebrity of sorts, the girl who had stood up in court and changed her own fate, now using her story to change others' fates as well. Her relationship with her father evolved slowly. Thomas began attending therapy himself, working to understand the choices he had made and the cost of his absence. When Emma was 9, he called and asked if they could have a video call. Emma agreed on her terms. They talked carefully at first, then gradually with more openness. He apologized for not being there. Emma accepted his apology but was clear, was her mother now. Thomas would have to earn his place in her life through consistent, loving presence, not through custody papers or promises of advantages. To his credit, Thomas did the work. He called regularly. He visited occasionally. He became involved in Emma's life in a limited but genuine way. He attended the ribbon-cutting ceremony for the first official Voices program location and saw tears in his eyes as he watched his daughter speak to a room full of people about trauma and healing and the power of unconditional love. On a warm afternoon in late spring, sat on the front porch of the old Victorian house on Maple Street. Emma was inside doing homework. Max was napping on the porch rug, his face peaceful in sleep, was reading a letter from a therapist in California who had heard about the Voices program and wanted to start a branch there. She thought about that rainy day 3 years ago when she had driven Emma to the animal shelter, not knowing if she was making a terrible mistake or the best decision of her life. She thought about the transformation that had occurred between Emma and Max, how 2 broken souls had healed each other, and in doing so, had healed her as well. Emma came outside and curled up next to her grandmother on the porch swing, and Max immediately lifted his head and padded over to rest it on Emma's lap. The 3 of them sat together in the golden afternoon light. Broken things made whole, lost things found. A family forged not by blood or law but by the deliberate choice to show up, day after day, with unconditional love. "Grandma," Emma asked, "do you think Max knows he changed my life?" Stroked her granddaughter's hair, watching the dog who had become the bridge between Emma and the world. "I think Max knows exactly what he did," said softly. "Just like he knows that you saved him too. That's the thing about real love, Emma. It's never just one person saving another. It's 2 people saving each other, making each other whole. That's what family is." Emma squeezed her grandmother's hand, and Max pressed his head deeper into her lap. And in that moment, the old house on Maple Street was filled with a peace that had been hard-won but absolutely unshakable. The broken girl and the broken dog had become the foundation of an unbreakable family. And their story, the story of raising a hand toward a wounded creature and finding salvation in return, would continue to inspire others for years to come. Because sometimes, the greatest healing happens when 2 people who have been broken choose to hold each other up, to speak truth in the face of systems that don't understand love, and to prove that family is not defined by blood or resources, but by the deliberate, daily choice to show up and love unconditionally. That was Emma's legacy. That was Max's gift. And that was greatest triumph, not just surviving but truly living. The end.